You've made a successful game and now it's time to get cracking on that follow-up, but picking a direction can be tricky. If you stray too far from the existing path, people will complain that it's too different. If you try to replicate the original, people will complain that it's not different enough. So what do you do? Hi, I'm Calivan, and today we're going to talk about making a sequel by looking at some of the choices that led to Frostpunk 2. If you're unfamiliar with Frostpunk, then the chances are that you've had your head buried in the snow, but as a quick overview, it's a colony management survival game with rich story elements. The Victorian steampunk world of the 1800s has collapsed as a great winter descends over the world, sending temperatures plunging and decimating humanity. However, all hope is not lost, and a few hardy, if somewhat chilly survivors cling on to life thanks to some giant thermal generators that provide enough power and heat to keep some small settlements alive. The first game has a somewhat narrow focus. You're managing no more than a few hundred citizens, and your goals revolve around not starving to death and not dying of hypothermia. The events of the main story campaign all take place over about a month and a half, so we're talking about survival rather than thrival. And yes, I know thrival isn't a word, but it sounds kinda nice. During this campaign, you're forced to make a number of pretty personal decisions, and although they may affect your entire population, those numbers are so small that each individual death or restriction of liberty has weight and meaning. It's one of those games where you set a lot of your own objectives, and for me the aim of the game is to get everyone through the immediate crisis without having to resort to some of the more draconian measures available. It's an excellent game that's well worth playing, and it has an almost unique approach to story, decisions and consequences that makes it highly engaging and rewarding. This brings me on to Frostpunk 2. It's a continuation of the story, but after years of progress rather than days or months. Your settlement now consists of tens of thousands instead of hundreds of people, and rather than dealing with the problems of the individual, you're dealing with the problems of society. The focus has been expanded dramatically. Personal has been replaced with politics, the buildings with districts, and you're looking for a steady supply of resources for the years ahead rather than just enough scraps to get you through a storm. This approach resulted in a significant amount of criticism, especially on the first week of release. The game was still well received, but there were a fair few voices that were very disappointed that Frostpunk 2 wasn't Frostpunk 1. This presents a problem for the developer, as you never want to disappoint your fans, especially those who had been eagerly awaiting a follow-up for years. But you also have to create the game you want, and sometimes that means just ignoring some of the dissenting voices, especially those who wrote the game off without giving it a chance. I always find Steam reviews fascinating and frustrating in equal measures. I don't understand how you can give a game a scathing negative write-up after playing for just 30 minutes, which isn't even enough time to finish the prologue/tutorial opener, or how you can play a game for 200 hours and then leave a negative review with just 10 characters of content. So this is the crux of today's issue, and it touches on themes that we spoke about during my Rise of Legends video. What do you do with a sequel? As far as I can tell, there are several paths available to you, and with modern games these are a bit different than your historical options. In the early days, you pretty much had two choices. Your first option would be release a new chapter in the story with a few new engine improvements and features, a bit like the difference between Command & Conquer and the first Red Alert. This was pretty standard fare and could be seen in the first sequel of many strategy and tactics series. There's too many to list, but Age of Empires and Desperados are another couple of great examples. The second direction was to essentially release an upgraded version of the same sort of game, taking advantage of huge improvements in graphics and other technology, as was seen in something like the jump between Civ 3 and Civ 4 or Tiberium Sun to Tiberium Wars. Things work a little differently these days. Due to digital distribution and a change in expectations, games are often a work in progress over many years rather than a single fire and forget release. Sure, we used to have expansion packs, but these were often limited in number and scope. Sometimes these added new missions and units but weren't real continuations of the story, and sometimes they were created by a different developer and were of mixed quality. There are some notable exceptions like Dawn of War that had a total of 3, but these were also a bit of an oddball mix called a standalone expansion that included a new faction, a new campaign for that faction, but didn't actually require the base game. These days DLC is the norm, and due to the prevalence of digital deluxe editions and day zero season passes, developers often commit themselves to a free content update and 2 or 3 DLC releases before the game is even available for purchase. It's not uncommon for there to be a second season of DLC, and some games just go on and on. I've lost count of how many DLCs they've released for Stellaris, but I'm pretty sure it sits somewhere between 10 and 15. This pattern has established something of a new convention. If you want to add more content to an existing game, you release a DLC. If you want to make radical changes or huge improvements to graphics and engine, you release a new game. There is one bit of additional information to consider. The impetus to take advantage of graphical improvements by releasing a brand new game is somewhat diminished these days, especially for a strategy audience. The reasons for this are mixed. I think one of them is probably related to the popularity of indie games that have demonstrated there are simple and effective ways to present a play area that doesn't require massively detailed 3D models, backgrounds and animations. The reason is a bit more nebulous, and I find it hard to describe in any other way other than graphics in strategy games have reached a point where they're good enough. Previously, this wasn't the case, and if you look at an RTS from the late 90s, the early and then the mid 2000s, you see massive improvements between them. However, if you think back to the last decade, things are pretty consistent. StarCraft 2 came out in 2012 and Company of Heroes 2 in 2013, and if you released a great strategy game that looked like either of those games today, some 11 or 12 years later, no one would have any complaints about the visual quality. This brings us back around to Frostpunk, a game from 2018. It still looks great today, and is certainly not something that would get much benefit from a visual overhaul. So if you're a fan of Frostpunk and you wanted more of the same game, then you should have been wary of a sequel, because what you really wanted was more DLC. The thing is, Frostpunk already has 3 DLC releases. 2 of them are decent sized additions, each one adding a new scenario and mechanics that was somewhere in the magnitude of the main one included with the base game. They both include their own fair share of features and story and are pretty fun. More of the same, sure, but worthy additions. The third includes a new map and an endless game mode, smaller in scope, sure, but it was sold at a reduced price, so it kinda makes sense. The developer could have decided to continue on with this, announcing a new season of DLC, but I'm not sure that would have been a great idea. How many times and how many ways can you tell the several hundred people trying to survive in a cold, desolate Frostland story? The base game explored this really well, with a main campaign that focused on preparing for a storm, and 3 additional scenarios that covered rescuing a doomed settlement, creating an automated outpost and tackling a large number of refugees. The DLC expanded on this pretty well, presenting a prequel scenario focused on construction and worker management, and an epilogue that covered governing a remote outpost and establishing trade with other survivors. Now, I love Frostpunk, but it's not without its limitations. The primary driving factor in all of the gameplay is time. You are always against the clock to secure resources and make the appropriate preparations before the approaching climactic event arrives. This key force is what gives so much weight to all of the decisions you have to make. Without the ticking clock, you could always take the efficient long-term approach and delay all of your problems until you can deal with them in a fair and humane way. But because the game always tells such a succinct and time-limited story, you don't have this option, and as such, the whole experience is way better for it. This factor of Frostpunk is what makes extending the individual stories difficult. Your people dutifully work against all hardships to finally be able to survive the storm, and then what? They continue to do exactly the same for another month until the superstorm arrives, and then what after that? The megastorm? This was actually explored in an endless game mode that was released with the smaller of the DLCs, which after a while becomes kind of dull as you get to the point where you're just doing the same thing on a loop, while having all of the technologies and upgrades completed. It's a nice little bit of extra fun, sure, but it's not a mode most people will spend much time in. So when it became time to expand on the game, I think options were limited. I'm pretty sure they could have gotten away with a 4th DLC, perhaps exploring the trials and tribulations of a different settlement. I think it would have needed quite a bit of additional story, some new mechanics and a new tree of laws, but it could probably have worked. However, I think this would have had to been where it ended, as after this point creative ideas would have been fully explored and any following release would be too similar from what came before it. From a commercial aspect, I think it's also highly probable that these DLC releases may not have been a great source of continued income for the studio. We don't obviously have any sales figures, but if Steam reviews are some indication of relative performance, the base game has over 100,000 reviews. If you add up all of the reviews from all 3 of the DLCs, it comes to about 2,500. So when it became time for 11-bit studios to expand the Frostpunk series further, they chose to make a sequel, and because it's a sequel rather than a DLC, they decided to make it somewhat different. However, I don't think it's quite as much of a departure from the norm as some people make out. I mentioned the key difference earlier, scale. The New London of the original Frostpunk starts with 80 people. The New London of Frostpunk 2 starts with 8,000, and I don't think it's any coincidence that this figure is exactly 2 orders of magnitude greater than the first. This change in size sums up the entire experience of Frostpunk 2, but unlike some of its detractors, I still think it's actually remarkably in touch with the original. For one thing, it's a complete thematic match. The art and sound direction are spot on, and there's absolutely no question about what universe you're in. The gameplay loop is also very similar. Your citizens have demands like heat, shelter and medical care, and there are intermediary demands like construction materials that are required to provide those needs. You must build infrastructure, collect resources and conduct research to better serve those requirements so they can be better managed when the temperature drops or the population rises. It diverges with the original in the way these are handled. Because you are now dealing with a steampunk city instead of a Victorian trailer park, everything is focused a lot more on the macro. You aren't troubled with the individual instances of sickness, crime or hunger, but instead the general needs of the population. However, you still must meet those needs, just as you still must scout out nearby territories and secure more resources. Sure, your scouting has moved on. No longer do you have 5 hardy frost-covered adventurers dragging a sledge across the frozen plains. Instead, you have whole teams venturing out into the local area, building paths and transport links. The big new introduction with Frostpunk 2 is politics. There are several factions that must be appeased. You can't just arbitrarily pass new laws as you did with your tiny settlement. Instead, you must propose the law to the council and try to get it ratified by the delegates. If they are hesitant, it may not pass, but you can decide to convince them to support you by making promises about research or construction projects. You can placate one faction by promising you'll let them choose the next law to be deliberated, but then you can bribe another faction to vote it down if you don't fancy their particular method of dealing with kids or medical problems. This is tied into one of the game's currencies, heat stamps. It's essentially a kind of coinage used to reward additional labour, and is spent whenever you engage in new construction projects that depart from the regular day-to-day tasks. The small amount of income from tax is never enough, so you must lean on the various factions to provide more. However, each time you do, their opinion of you drops, so it's another vital balancing act to keep them happy enough by following their preferred path, so you can tap them up for some currency at various points down the line. In this man's personal opinion, I think Frostpunk 2 is actually a pretty solid sequel, and I'm really glad they made the design decisions that they did. After completing the first game, what I really wanted is a continuation of the story, not the next chapter, but the next book. Like with many things, the challenges and operations of a society changes as it grows, and what I wanted was to experience this change. I didn't want to see how they weathered the next storm, I wanted to see how they weathered the next decade. What I certainly didn't want was to be back in the same old frozen crater with 500 people and a slightly different method of gathering lumber. If I'm honest, I think a lot of the people who were dissatisfied with Frostpunk 2 probably got their reasons all in a muddle. One of the biggest factors in the first game was the struggle. When you went into the game for the first time, it was simply impossible to do very well, and a lot of the story and the drama came from the difficulty in accomplishing all of the goals in a way you deemed satisfactory. Put simply, the default difficulty level in Frostpunk 2 is just too low, and as such you aren't really forced to properly interact with many of the mechanics in anything other than a cursory way. This leads to a lot of disengagement and time skipping. After all, why bother reading up on all of the different factions' goals and aspirations and making careful decisions in terms of research and lawmaking when they don't have enough of an impact on your game for you to really notice? At the harder difficulty levels, it's a far better experience, and my second playthrough was way more enjoyable than the first. I had to put a lot of thought into each decision and be very careful with how I placed my districts and buildings to ensure I got as many of the location and adjacency bonuses as possible. I needed to put an equal amount of brain power into each technology I researched or law I passed, so my trust and support levels with each faction remained high, allowing me to spend that favour when I needed it to gain more currency or bargaining power at critical junctures. All of this extra engagement dramatically enhanced my game experience, and it does make me wonder why the default difficulty level was so low. On the subject of the second playthrough, the game does appear to have quite a bit of replayability. The campaign has several divergent paths, and they are different enough to change both the gameplay and the story significantly. I have no idea how much variation there is to be found, but my third attempt is already shaping into something very different from the first and the second. There is also an Endless Utopia scenario, a gameplay mode that seems to have a lot more breadth and depth than the Endless mode included with the Rifts DLC of the first Frostpunk. I've only put my toe into it so far, but it's already shaping up to be something different from the main story campaign, with its own set of factions, objectives and progression requirements. In the spirit of balance, Frostpunk 2 is not a game without flaws. For one thing, it's not as much of a concise and refined experience as the first game. Some games are greater than the sum of their parts, and the original Frostpunk was almost perfect in that regard. It's almost impossible to replicate that sort of magic, and as such it's quite likely that even with future editions its successor will never quite live up to that standard. I am interested to see what sort of changes and new directions future DLC will bring, but that's something for another time. There are a few more specific problems. For one thing, the difficulty curve seems to be pointing the wrong way. I found the first 2 chapters a lot more challenging than the last 2, and that really did take the edge off the conclusion. I wouldn't go as far as calling it anticlimactic, but I do think it could have been handled a little better. I also felt that a lot of the research, upgrade and future development options are a little superfluous. It takes a lot of time to implement them, and your population is steadily growing over time. If you do take your time and take the game a little slow so you can firm up your economy, then all that additional output just goes into providing for the extra population growth that happens during the time you spend gathering, researching and upgrading. It's not an approach that gives you much of an advantage for the next chapter of the story, and as such it's not very rewarding. That said, it's still a very compelling sequel, and if you enjoyed Frostpunk then I think you should definitely give Frostpunk 2 a try. I don't think all of the criticisms regarding scale were that valid, and despite the increased population I still felt connected to my citizens, and the game makes a concerted effort to tell you their stories and provide examples of how the laws and attitudes affect the individuals. Some of them are a little heartbreaking, whether they be kids defending themselves with razor blades or the elderly willingly wandering off into the storm to save food for their grandchildren. I certainly found some of these events moving enough to pass laws to prevent their reoccurrence, even if the resultant statistical benefits were not exactly what my city needed at the time. So, Frostpunk 2 gets my recommendation, and I think it's the right way to handle a sequel. But do yourself a favour and don't start on anything easier than Officer difficulty. If you're a veteran of these sorts of games, then perhaps ramp it up to Steward. It might be a bit tricky while you're learning the ropes, but honestly you'll have a much more challenging and therefore engaging experience because of it. Hi there! Thanks for wrapping up warm and huddling around the generator with me. If you enjoyed this video then click the like button, and if you've got thoughts about the first or the second game then I'd love to read them in a comment or on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.